It was designed to help children. That was the stated goal, the professional justification, the reason a university gave its approval. And yet, what unfolded inside that study left lasting harm on the very children it claimed to serve. The researchers involved spent years unable to speak about it openly. The study itself was buried, never formally published, kept out of the scientific record for decades. The question that lingers is not simply what went wrong inside one room in Iowa in 1939. The deeper question is how the scientific method, that careful, rigorous, skepticism-driven process, can be approved, funded, and conducted, and still produce something that no ethics board today would ever permit to begin. To understand what researchers wanted, you have to understand the scientific climate of the era. The early 20th century was a period of genuine optimism about applying systematic observation to human behavior. If you could measure workflows and optimize factory output through careful analysis, as Frederick Winslow Taylor had argued with industrial labor, then perhaps you could apply the same logic to human development itself. Observe a condition, form a hypothesis, test it, adjust based on results. That framework, the core of the scientific method developed across centuries of inquiry, was being extended into territory it had never been tested in before: the minds of children. The monster study, as it would eventually come to be known, was conducted at the University of Iowa. A graduate student worked under a prominent speech pathologist. The research question, on its surface, was legitimate. What role does environment and feedback play in the development of stuttering in children? At the time, stuttering was poorly understood. It was treated as a kind of affliction, something fixed and perhaps inevitable. One documented viewpoint from within that research environment held that a stuttering child was in effect a crippled child, a framing that tells you something about how the condition was perceived before the study began. The design, at a high level, involved dividing orphaned children into groups and providing them with systematically different types of verbal feedback about their speech. Some children received positive reinforcement. Others received negative, critical feedback, even when their speech did not warrant it. The mechanism being tested was whether the feedback itself, the social and verbal environment around a child's speech, could influence whether fluency problems developed or worsened. In terms of hypothesis structure, it followed the logic of controlled experimentation. There was a variable, there were groups, there was observation. Early in the research, there was enough confidence in the approach to continue. The children were available through the institution that housed them, the methodology was internally coherent, and the supervising academic had standing in the field. From within the framework of the time, this looked like science advancing into a poorly understood domain. That confidence, built on procedural logic rather than ethical reflection, is exactly where the trouble compounded. The warning signs were structural, not just incidental. The children involved were orphans, a population with no parental advocates, no independent voice, and no ability to withdraw consent in any meaningful sense. The institution housing them was responsible for their welfare, but the study operated with access granted rather than with robust independent oversight. There was no modern ethics board, no informed consent framework, no independent review mechanism equivalent to what researchers face today. The scientific method requires rigorous skepticism about interpretation, but in this case, the skepticism was applied to the data and not to the design itself. What the negative feedback group experienced was repeated, deliberate criticism of their speech. Criticism delivered to children who, in some cases, had no prior fluency problems. According to what became known of the study after it surfaced decades later, children in the negative feedback group showed signs of psychological distress. Some reportedly became more hesitant, more withdrawn, more self-conscious about speaking. The study was never published. That decision, made by the lead researcher, appears to have been connected to awareness that the findings and the methods would not survive scrutiny. The work was suppressed rather than retracted, which meant no formal accounting, no public correction, and no warning to the field. The cascade from that suppression was a long silence. Decades passed. The children grew up. The study existed in informal academic memory, but not in any published record that could be examined, criticized, or built upon. When it did eventually surface in public reporting in the early 2000s, the University of Iowa issued a formal apology to the surviving participants. That apology was itself a significant institutional moment, an acknowledgement that harm had occurred, that the subjects deserved recognition, and that the absence of a published record had not erased the ethical weight of what was done. The investigation into what had happened was complicated by the very suppression that had protected the researchers for so long. Evidence had to be reconstructed from archival records, thesis documents, and institutional memory. Competing interpretations existed around the severity of long-term harm to individuals, around the intent of the researchers, and around whether the absence of publication reflected guilt or simply professional caution in a different era. What was not disputed was the basic design. Children who could not consent were subjected to deliberate negative feedback. Some experienced distress, and the results were hidden. The root causes operate on three distinct layers. Technically, the design exposed a vulnerable population to psychological manipulation without any safeguard against harm. Organizationally, there was no independent review, no ethics oversight, and no mechanism for the children themselves or their advocates to object. The institution that housed the children effectively granted access without the protections that would be considered fundamental today. Ethically, the framing of the children as research subjects, rather than as individuals with rights, reflects a broader pattern in mid-20th century human subjects research, a pattern that would eventually produce the regulatory frameworks that now govern every study involving people. What changed because of cases like this one, and the monster study was one of several that accumulated into a crisis of conscience for research ethics, was the development of formal institutional review. The principle that human subjects must provide informed consent, that vulnerable populations require additional protections, and that independent oversight must exist before a study can proceed, became codified in research regulation. Today, a proposal designed the way this study was designed would not pass an ethics review. The population, the methodology, the absence of any benefit to the subjects themselves, each element would trigger objection. That is exactly the point. The approval process exists because approval was once given too easily. There is genuine uncertainty in how we interpret research from an earlier era. The scientists involved were operating within the norms of their time, and some historians of science argue that retrospective judgment requires historical context. That argument has limits. The suppression of the study, the decision not to publish, suggests that at least some of the people involved understood, even then, that what had been done could not withstand scrutiny. Uncertainty about norms does not extend to the deliberate concealment of outcomes. What the monster study ultimately illustrates is not that science is dangerous, but that science without independent ethical constraint can drift into harm without anyone raising a formal alarm. The method itself, observation, hypothesis, testing, revision, is not the failure. The failure was in the architecture around the method. Who could object? Who was protected? Who had standing to say stop? Those structural questions are what research ethics now attempts to answer before the first subject ever walks through the door. And the adjacent question worth sitting with is this: what studies approved today, under current standards, might the next generation look back on with the same discomfort we now feel reading about a group of orphaned children in Iowa who were never supposed to find out what had been done to them? This content is for educational purposes only. Do not attempt to recreate any described experiment or procedure.